My name is Clara Jennings. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a senior financial consultant in Seattle, Washington. Numbers have always made sense to me: steady, predictable, loyal, in a way people rarely are. But nothing in my life could have prepared me for what happened on my 35th birthday, the night I learned that even the people who raised you can become strangers when money is involved. It was supposed to be a celebration. My parents had insisted on hosting a dinner at their house near Lake Union. My mother said she wanted to make it special. "You work too hard, Clara. Let us take care of you for once." I remember laughing, thinking how rare it was for her to say something like that. My father, ever the banker, even mentioned he'd ordered champagne, the good kind. I should have felt touched. Instead, there was a strange heaviness that clung to me all day, like a quiet warning I didn't yet understand. When I arrived that evening, the house was warm, glowing with soft candlelight. Jazz played in the background, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe this was going to be a turning point. A rare night where we'd just be family, not roles, not responsibilities. My mother kissed my cheek, my father hugged me tightly, and my younger brother Ethan, always the golden child, lifted his glass and said, "To Clara, the smartest person I know." Everyone laughed, and I felt that fragile warmth spread through me. But what I didn't know was that while we toasted under the dim light of our family dining room, my parents had already made a plan. By the time dessert was served, they would quietly drain $1.5 million, 10 years of my savings, from the joint account we'd opened for family security. They believed I'd never see it coming. And for a moment, neither did I. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what started as a betrayal turned into something else entirely, a revelation about trust, love, and what it really means to protect yourself, even from the people you never thought you'd have to. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next story. It helps this channel keep growing and inspires us to bring you more real, emotional stories that hit close to home. Now, let me take you back to that evening, the night that changed everything I thought I knew about family. I still remember the smell of my mother's rosemary chicken drifting through the kitchen. She'd set the table with her best silverware, the same set she only used on holidays. My father poured me a glass of wine, insisting I try the Merlot he'd saved for a special occasion. And Ethan, with his effortless charm, told me he was proud of me, something he'd never said before. Looking back, I can see the choreography, every smile, every gesture, carefully designed to keep me comfortable, to make me lower my guard. When my father asked if I could check a quick notification on his computer in the office, something about a surprise gift, I didn't think twice. I left my phone on his desk, my banking app open from earlier that day. I didn't realize that the real surprise was already in motion. In less than 3 minutes, everything changed. While I was helping my mother carry dishes to the sink, my smartwatch vibrated. A bank alert flashed across the tiny screen. Transfer request, $500,000 initiated from joint account. At first, I thought it was an error. My heart stopped, then raced so hard I could hear it in my ears. The room blurred around me, the laughter, the music, the smell of food. I looked over at my father. He was smiling, raising his glass, toasting to me, to family, to the future. My mother's hand rested lightly on his arm. Ethan was laughing about something I couldn't hear. And I knew. They'd done it. My own parents had taken everything I'd built. But here's what they didn't know. That $1.5 million wasn't my real fortune. It was a trap, one I'd set months earlier when the whispers of their curiosity turned into something sharper, more dangerous. I had seen the way my father's questions about my accounts grew specific, how my mother had started hinting that family should share their blessings. I'd watched Ethan brag about an upcoming business venture, a music cafe he had no plan to fund himself. I saw the pattern, and this time I refused to play along. So as they toasted with champagne, believing they'd finally claimed the life I built without their help, I smiled back. I knew that by the time the night ended, I would have proof of everything. Every transfer, every intention, every whispered conversation they thought I'd never hear. And the best part? They had no idea that I was already one step ahead. That night, I didn't confront them. I didn't cry or shout or make a scene. I stayed calm. I laughed when they made jokes. I even thanked them for the dinner. Then I went home, poured myself a cup of tea, and watched the security footage from my smartwatch. A silent, clear video of my father sitting at his desk, using my phone, transferring every cent he thought would secure Ethan's future. The shock I felt wasn't anger. It was clarity. It was the moment I realized I wasn't just betrayed. I was free. Free from pretending that their approval mattered. Free from carrying the weight of being the strong one. For years, I believed that family loyalty meant forgiveness, no matter the cost. But that night, I learned a different truth. Real love doesn't steal from you and call it care. Over the next few days, I prepared for what would come next, a confrontation that would not be fueled by rage, but by evidence, precision, and grace. Because if my parents wanted to test how disciplined I was, they were about to find out. And as painful as that birthday was, it became the line that divided my past from my future, the night I stopped being their safety net and became my own protector. So, tell me this. If you discovered that your parents had secretly taken your life savings, would you confront them immediately, no matter the emotional cost? B, wait, gather evidence and strike when the time is right? Drop your answer, A or B, in the comments. I'm curious to see which path you choose. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a modest 2-story house that smelled faintly of pine and laundry detergent. From the outside, our home looked like every other on our quiet street. Neatly trimmed hedges, a basketball hoop in the driveway, wind chimes that danced on summer evenings. But inside, there was an invisible current that ran through every room, separating love from approval, affection from respect. I learned early that in our family, those things weren't always the same. My father, a banker by profession, believed in order, precision, and control. He was the kind of man who ironed his jeans and balanced his checkbook twice a week. My mother, gentle but cautious, orbited around his structure, smoothing over tension the way you might cover a crack in the wall with a fresh coat of paint. Together, they built a life defined by predictability. Yet beneath that tidy surface lay a quiet imbalance that shaped the person I became. Then there was Ethan, my younger brother, 2 years my junior but decades younger in spirit. Ethan was magnetic, charming, careless in a way that seemed to delight everyone. He was the golden child, the one who could fail spectacularly and still be celebrated for his potential. I was the steady one, the planner, the problem solver, the one they could rely on. But reliability, I would later learn, often becomes the mask people wear when they're starving for acknowledgement. The differences began small. When Ethan got a C on his report card, my parents said he just learned differently. When I got an A, my father would nod and ask if I thought I could do better next time. When Ethan forgot to do his chores, my mother would laugh and say, "He's just so creative. His head's always in the clouds." But when I forgot, on the rare occasions that I did, it was a lecture about responsibility. I remember one winter afternoon when I was 10. I had spent weeks building a snow fort in our backyard, carefully packing each block of snow so it would hold firm. The day I finished it, Ethan ran through it with his sled, destroying the wall I'd built. I cried, not because of the fort, but because I had worked so hard and no one seemed to care. My father told me to stop overreacting. My mother said, "He didn't mean it, honey." Ethan, of course, didn't apologize. Later that night, I sat by my window, watching the snow fall again, realizing that in my family, effort didn't earn protection. As we grew older, that dynamic only deepened. Ethan became the boy with big dreams. He wanted to start a band, then a clothing brand, then a food truck. Every time, my parents financed the idea, small loans that became big debts. When those ventures failed, they'd sigh and say, "At least he's trying." I went to college on scholarships, working late nights at a coffee shop to pay for books. My parents never offered help, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't think I needed it. "You're so independent, Clara," my mother would say with pride that didn't feel like pride at all. "We don't worry about you." I wanted to ask her why being worry-free also meant being unseen. It's strange, the way favoritism disguises itself as love. My parents never said they loved Ethan more. They didn't have to. It was in the way they celebrated his smallest wins and dismissed my biggest ones. It was in the way my father's voice softened when Ethan made mistakes, but turned sharp when I succeeded. It was in my mother's excuses, her endless ability to turn Ethan's irresponsibility into charm. Once, when I was 15, I was chosen to represent my high school at a statewide math competition. It felt like a huge deal. I had studied for months, fueled by coffee and determination. The night before the event, I overheard my parents discussing Ethan's soccer game scheduled for the same morning. "We'll go to his match," my father said. "Clara will understand." My mother agreed. She's used to being independent. That phrase again, used to it, as though self-sufficiency were a gift, not a defense mechanism. They never came to the competition. I won first place, took a photo alone, and took the bus home with my medal tucked into my jacket pocket. That was the day I learned that success meant nothing if it couldn't make the people you love look up from someone else's story. My father believed he was teaching us lessons about the world, that the disciplined earn and the reckless are saved. My mother thought she was protecting Ethan from disappointment. Neither realized they were teaching me something else entirely, that love without equality becomes conditional, and that silence is the tax you pay to keep the peace. There were good moments, of course. Family dinners filled with laughter, holidays that shimmered with nostalgia. My mother would hum as she cooked, and my father would loosen his tie and tell us stories about his early career. But even in those moments, there was an invisible script we all followed. Ethan would be charming and careless, I would be composed and grateful, and the world would stay in balance. I played my part so well that sometimes I forgot it was a performance. When I left home for college, I promised myself I wouldn't need anyone again. My father called it ambition. It was actually survival. I worked 2 jobs, studied harder than anyone I knew, and never once asked for help. I thought if I became successful enough, they would finally see me, not as the stable daughter, but as the person who had built something out of nothing. For a brief moment after graduation, I believed it might have worked. I was hired by a respected financial firm in Seattle, and my father congratulated me with a handshake instead of a hug. My mother said, "You always did know how to take care of yourself." Ethan, of course, had just dropped out of his second college program, this time to find his true calling. They threw him a barbecue to celebrate his new beginning. I got a card that said, "We're proud of you," written in my mother's handwriting, unsigned by my father. Sometimes I wonder if my parents understood what they were doing, or if it all happened too gradually to notice. Maybe they thought they were balancing things, pouring more into Ethan because he needed more. Maybe they thought I didn't notice. But children always notice. Even as adults, we remember every time love was measured instead of given freely. That imbalance became the quiet rhythm of my life, shaping every choice I made. It made me careful with people, wary of depending on anyone. It made me build walls disguised as independence. It made me crave fairness so deeply that I began to study systems that couldn't lie: numbers, data, strategy. Finance gave me what family didn't: proof that effort equals outcome. But what I didn't realize then was that those same childhood patterns were still alive, hiding beneath the surface of my adult life. That same blind trust that once longed for my father's approval would later become the reason I opened a joint account with him. And that same instinct to protect peace at all costs would one day make me vulnerable to betrayal. Family shapes us in ways we don't see until the damage is done. For years, I thought being the responsible one was my strength. But the truth was, it was the armor I built to survive being unseen. And when my parents eventually crossed the line between neglect and deception, it wasn't an isolated event. It was the final echo of a pattern that had begun decades earlier. On quiet streets, under warm lights, in a house where love was always just slightly uneven. When I left Portland for the University of Washington, I remember standing in the bus station with one suitcase, a duffel bag, and a determination that felt heavier than either. My parents didn't come to see me off. They had already said goodbye at dinner the night before, quick, efficient, polite. My father handed me a check for $200, calling it a little cushion. My mother told me to call when I settled in. Ethan was asleep on the couch, his latest late-night adventure apparently too exhausting to wake from. So I walked out into the gray morning with that peculiar blend of fear and freedom that defines the first steps of independence. Seattle felt alive in a way Portland never had. The city hummed, Coffee shops spilling light onto rain-slick sidewalks, buses sighing at every corner, people moving fast as though they knew exactly where they belonged. I didn't belong anywhere yet, but I had a plan. I rented a small room in a shared apartment in the U District, just a 10-minute walk from campus. My rent was $420 a month, utilities included, and I stretched every dollar like it was elastic. I took a part-time job at a bookstore on the Ave, the kind of place that smelled like dust and old paperbacks, and another job as a research assistant for a graduate student studying market behaviors. During the day, I sat in economics lectures surrounded by students who wore designer jackets and talked casually about ski trips to Whistler. At night, I worked until closing, then came home and did homework until dawn. I didn't have much of a social life, but I had something better: momentum. Money was my anchor. While other students talked about what they wanted to buy, I thought about what I wanted to build. Every paycheck was split the same way: half to rent and food, half to savings. I started a simple spreadsheet to track my expenses, color-coded by category. I loved the order of it, the clarity. Numbers didn't play favorites. They didn't punish or praise. They just told the truth. Sometimes, when I was tired or lonely, I'd think about Ethan. By then, he was studying art at a community college back home, or at least he was supposed to be. Every few months, I get a text from my mother about how Ethan's struggling again, or your father helped him out a little. It was always money. There was always a story attached to make it sound noble. Ethan needed new equipment for his photography class, or his car had broken down, or he was going to Europe to find inspiration. I would listen, nod, and hang up, reminding myself that I had chosen this path precisely so I wouldn't have to ask anyone for anything. After graduation, I got an internship at Piermont & Wells, a financial consulting firm in downtown Seattle. It was unpaid, but I treated it like a full-time job. I arrived before the lights turned on, left long after the cleaning crew arrived, and absorbed everything I could. I learned how markets moved like tides, predictable in pattern, chaotic in timing. I learned that most people lose money not because they're unlucky, but because they're emotional. I promised myself I would never let emotion dictate my future. 6 months later, that unpaid internship turned into a permanent position. The first real paycheck of my life felt like validation wrapped in paper. I deposited it carefully, stared at the number, and thought of every night I'd spent calculating grocery lists to the penny. It wasn't much, but it was mine. While others my age began upgrading their lives, nicer apartments, newer cars, spontaneous weekends away, I did the opposite. I kept the same small apartment, still took the bus to work, still ate oatmeal for breakfast most mornings. The difference was invisible but monumental. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was building. By 25, I had started investing. Nothing dramatic, just small, deliberate steps. A few index funds, a handful of reliable stocks, a modest Roth IRA. I took notes on everything I did, treating it like a science experiment. I learned the slow satisfaction of compound interest, of quiet, patient accumulation. My father once told me that discipline is boring but profitable. He was right, though I doubt he ever expected me to outgrow the version of discipline he'd tried to teach. Around that time, Ethan dropped out of college for the second time. He said formal education didn't align with his creative vision. My parents didn't seem bothered. They threw him a party for following his heart. I sent a polite card and didn't attend. It was easier to stay distant than to feel that old ache of comparison. As the years passed, I moved up within the company, one promotion at a time. By 30, I was managing high-value client portfolios and advising executives twice my age. I became known for precision, for catching errors before they turned into disasters. People began trusting me with their fortunes, and I treated that trust like sacred currency. But my personal life remained simple. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment overlooking Lake Union, small but filled with sunlight. I cooked most nights, spent weekends reading or hiking, and found peace in quiet routines. My colleagues used to joke that I lived like a monk with a 401k. I didn't mind. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't avoiding pleasure. I was avoiding chaos. Every now and then, my parents would call. The conversations always began with pleasantries and ended with updates about Ethan. "He's starting a new project," my mother would say. Your father's helping him get started." I would nod and offer polite encouragement, even as I realized how familiar the script had become. My father never asked about my work. My mother never asked if I was lonely. Their assumption that I was fine had hardened into indifference. It was during one of those calls, when I was 28, that my father brought up the idea of a joint account. He said it was for family emergencies, a way to make sure things were handled smoothly if anything ever happened to me. "It's just good planning," he'd said. Coming from a banker, it sounded practical. I agreed, though I kept the account separate from my main assets. I told myself it was harmless, a gesture of trust that cost me nothing. I didn't realize I was giving them the key to a door I would one day have to lock. As my career grew, so did my independence. I began teaching financial literacy workshops for young women, volunteering at local community centers on weekends. I wanted others to know what I'd learned the hard way, that money isn't about greed. It's about control, choice, and peace of mind. Watching women realize they could take charge of their own security filled me with a quiet pride. It felt like rewriting the story of my own childhood, one spreadsheet at a time. There were still moments when the old ache returned, family holidays when Ethan's small victories were celebrated while mine were treated as inevitabilities. But by then, I had stopped seeking their approval. I was too busy building a life defined by something rarer than love, respect for myself. Looking back, I see that my independence didn't begin as confidence. It began as necessity. Every long night, every calculated risk, every dollar saved was my way of rewriting the story that started in that house in Portland. I was proving, to them, to myself, that I didn't need to be rescued, funded, or validated. But independence, I would later learn, is a double-edged sword. It gives you strength, but it can also blind you to the small cracks forming beneath the surface, the ones that eventually widen into betrayal. Because when you spend your whole life building walls to protect yourself, sometimes the people you should fear the most are already standing inside them. It didn't happen all at once. The shift from affection to entitlement, from "we're proud of you" to "you owe us." It crept in quietly, like fog rolling in from Puget Sound, soft and harmless at first, until it wrapped around everything I thought I knew about family. By my early 30s, I had built a life that should have been unshakable. My name, Clara Jennings, was on every account and every property deed I owned. I had a stable position at a respected financial firm, a comfortable apartment overlooking Lake Union, and a sense of peace I had fought to earn. But that calm began to fracture the moment my parents' curiosity turned into obsession. It started innocently enough. One afternoon, during Sunday lunch at my parents' home, my father asked if I had considered diversifying my investments. "You know," he said, cutting into his roast beef, "I read that certain accounts can be vulnerable to market swings. You must be keeping a close eye on those." His tone was casual, but the question was specific, too specific. My father was a retired banker. He didn't ask idle questions about account structures unless he wanted to know how to access them. My mother, ever the diplomat, chimed in with a sweet smile. "Your father just worries, that's all. You've done so well for yourself, Clara. We're just curious how you manage everything." I gave a polite answer, something vague about long-term investments and safety nets. But something in me tensed. It wasn't concern I heard in her voice. It was calculation. Over the next few months, their questions multiplied. Every visit came with another subtle probe. My father asked which bank handled my accounts these days. My mother asked whether I'd named them as emergency contacts, just in case. They had always been interested in my career, but this was different. It wasn't pride, it was reconnaissance. Then there were the little things that didn't add up. One night, I came home from work and found the drawer in my desk slightly open. Nothing was missing, but the placement of my folders had shifted by half an inch, enough for me to notice. Another time, my laptop had been moved, its screen faintly glowing as though someone had touched it recently. I lived alone, and my building's security was tight. My stomach turned as I realized there were only two people who still had a spare key: my parents. I convinced myself it was paranoia. I wanted to believe they wouldn't cross that line. But denial is the most dangerous form of love. It protects your heart at the expense of your boundaries. Around that same time, Ethan, my younger brother, announced his newest venture. He wanted to open a music cafe in downtown Seattle, a place for local artists to create and connect. He said it would require a modest investment, which in Ethan's vocabulary meant someone else's money. My parents were ecstatic. "It's such a brilliant idea," my mother said, her eyes glowing the way they never did when she talked about my work. My father nodded, already slipping into his role as financier. A few weeks later, during another family dinner, the conversation turned, as it always did, to Ethan's dreams. "You know," my father began, swirling his wine, "families should support one another. Ethan just needs a bit of help to get started." I smiled politely and said, "That's wonderful. I hope it works out." What I didn't say was that a bit of help had already drained their retirement savings once before. My mother leaned closer, her voice soft, conspiratorial. "You've done so well, Clara. Maybe you could offer some guidance, or even a small contribution? You've always been so good with money." It wasn't the first time she'd suggested it, but there was a new tone in her voice, expectation instead of request. It stung, not because she asked, but because she assumed. I'd spent years being the stable one, the safe one, the daughter who never needed anything. Now that stability had turned me into their solution. My success wasn't mine anymore. It was ours. I began noticing patterns I had ignored for years. The small comments that hinted at resentment cloaked in praise. "You're lucky you're so responsible," my father said one night. Not everyone has that kind of discipline. He meant Ethan, of course. My mother would sigh and add, "He just hasn't found his way yet." And always beneath those words was the quiet suggestion that I should help him find it. Then one afternoon, I came home to find a voicemail from my bank. The manager said my father had stopped by asking about the withdrawal limits on our joint account. My heart sank. That account had existed for over a decade, originally opened when I was 20, and naive enough to believe my father's claim that it was for family security. I had nearly forgotten it existed, using it only occasionally for shared expenses. But the balance had grown significantly over the years, enough to tempt anyone who thought they deserved a share. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every small red flag I had ignored. The way my father had accidentally taken my laptop home once after a visit, the time my mother had asked out of nowhere how long it would take to move large sums of money in an emergency, the way Ethan had started referring to my success as the family's success. Each piece clicked into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. The real turning point came at a holiday gathering. I had stepped outside to the porch for some air when I overheard my parents talking through the open kitchen window. My father's voice was low but sharp. "She must have close to $1 million saved by now," he said. My mother answered, "Maybe more. It's not like she spends it. And Ethan needs help. It's only fair." There was a pause before my father replied, "We'll figure something out. She trusts us." Those 3 words, "she trusts us," burned into me. Trust was supposed to be sacred. For years, I had convinced myself that our differences were simply emotional, not moral. But that night, I realized that my parents didn't see me as their daughter anymore. They saw me as an asset, an account to be accessed, a solution to be managed. The next morning, I called a locksmith and changed the locks on my apartment. I also began documenting everything: emails, messages, bank statements. I wasn't ready to believe they would actually cross the line, but I needed to be prepared if they did. I even met with my financial advisor, who looked at me gravely after I explained my suspicions. "Family exploitation isn't as rare as you think," he said. "People do desperate things when entitlement becomes normalized." He was right. What I once mistook for love had turned into something transactional. Every favor, every conversation came with unspoken expectations. My achievements weren't celebrated, they were audited. My father's professional pride had curdled into envy, my mother's affection into quiet justification. Ethan's failures were no longer his problem. They were my responsibility. Still, part of me resisted the truth. We're taught to believe that family deserves endless forgiveness, that blood is thicker than betrayal. So I kept showing up for dinners, smiling through my discomfort, pretending I didn't notice the questions, the probing, the subtle manipulation. But beneath my calm surface, I was building something new: awareness. Love without respect becomes ownership, and I had become their possession. But I also knew something they didn't, that discipline isn't just about saving money. It's about saving yourself from people who think they have the right to take what you've earned. I didn't confront them then. Instead, I began planning. Quietly, deliberately, the way I approached every other problem in my life. Because I knew this wasn't just about protecting my wealth, it was about protecting my peace. And if there was one thing my parents had taught me, it was how to recognize value. I just never imagined that one day I'd have to calculate the price of their love. When you spend your life studying numbers, you start to see patterns everywhere, in markets, in people, even in betrayal. After that night on the porch, hearing my parents speak about my savings as if they were discussing family property, something inside me changed. I stopped waiting for decency and started preparing for truth. I didn't react with anger. Anger was emotional, unpredictable, and I had spent my entire life mastering control. What I decided to build was not revenge, it was protection. The same discipline that had built my career would now become my armor. I began by assembling a team of people I trusted, a quiet alliance of professionals who had no connection to my family. The first was Grace Liu, a forensic accountant with a reputation for uncovering embezzlement so delicately that the perpetrators didn't realize they'd been exposed until the evidence was already in court. When I laid out my suspicions, she listened without judgment, her pen moving across a notepad in clean, deliberate strokes. "You're describing a pattern of familial exploitation," she said calmly. "It happens more often than you think. The good news is you're aware of it early. That gives you an advantage." Next was Thomas Reed, a lawyer specializing in financial and family disputes. He was steady, composed, the kind of man who spoke in precise sentences that could double as legal strategies. When I explained that my parents were likely planning to withdraw money from the joint account, he nodded slowly. "You have two priorities," he said. "Secure your actual wealth and create a structure that exposes intent without endangering yourself." The last piece of my team was Ava Morales, a cybersecurity expert whose quiet confidence made me trust her instantly. She worked with financial firms to track digital theft, and when I told her about my parents' previous attempts to access my laptop and financial platforms, she smiled sadly. "They've already breached your trust," she said. "Let's make sure they never breach your data." Over the next several weeks, we built what I came to call the fortress. Grace began by helping me move my real assets, roughly $6 million spread across stocks, retirement accounts, and real estate, into new, protected structures. Together, we established 3 limited liability companies, each in a different state. The LLCs owned the properties and accounts, but my name was buried behind layers of corporate paperwork. "If anyone tries to trace your assets," Grace explained, "they'll hit legal fog." Thomas created an irrevocable trust, naming me as the sole beneficiary. It was structured in a way that even I couldn't easily dismantle, ensuring that no joint party, especially not my parents, could legally access it. "The law can be cold," he said, sliding the papers across the desk for me to sign, "but in cases like this, it's the best protection you have." Meanwhile, Ava strengthened the digital walls. She set up alerts that would notify me of any login attempts, changes to banking information, or unusual IP activity. She also helped me create false trails, fake documents, dummy spreadsheets, and staged browser histories that suggested I was consolidating my wealth into the one vulnerable account my parents already knew about, the joint family account. The irony was painful. That account had been born from trust, opened when I was 20 at my father's suggestion. He had framed it as practicality. "If anything ever happens to you, Clara, we need to be able to handle things quickly." I had agreed out of respect, not realizing I was giving away the first key to my autonomy. Now that key would become bait. I transferred $1.5 million into the joint account, a fraction of my total worth, but a number large enough to feel irresistible. The transfer wasn't random. I liquidated a few visible investments, ones my father knew about from casual conversations, and moved the proceeds there publicly, ensuring that the transactions would show up on bank statements. Ava created a digital breadcrumb trail, setting up fake planning documents labeled post-birthday restructuring and investment consolidation plan. Every click, every email was carefully crafted to make the account look like the center of my financial universe. But building the trap wasn't just a technical exercise. It was emotional warfare, quiet, precise, excruciating. There were nights I sat in my apartment, staring at the ledger on my screen, feeling the weight of what I was doing. They were my parents. The same people who once packed my lunches, who tucked me into bed after thunderstorms, who sent cards with glitter hearts when I was away at college. And yet, those memories now felt like postcards from a place that no longer existed. One evening over tea, Grace asked me a question that cut through my practiced composure. "Are you ready for what this will mean?" she said. "Not the money, the loss." I looked out the window at the city lights reflected in the water. "I think I already lost them," I said quietly. "This is just the moment I stop pretending I haven't." To test the trap, I began dropping subtle hints during our weekly calls. I mentioned that I was restructuring my portfolio after my upcoming 35th birthday, using phrases my father had taught me, language that sounded legitimate but not suspicious. I said I planned to simplify holdings and temporarily consolidate assets for a larger investment later in the year. Each time, I could hear the interest sharpening in his voice. My mother started calling more frequently, offering to meet for lunch or stop by just to catch up. During one visit, she noticed a folder labeled Retirement Account Summary on my desk, a decoy filled with meaningless spreadsheets. I watched her eyes linger on it longer than she realized. That evening, Ava sent me a text. "Access attempt detected. They took photos." The realization didn't bring anger. It brought confirmation. A few weeks later, I invited my parents to dinner at my apartment. I cooked their favorite meal: salmon, roasted vegetables, a bottle of Chardonnay. Everything looked warm, familiar, safe. Over dessert, I casually mentioned, after my birthday, I might consolidate everything into one main account for efficiency. My father smiled the way people do when they think they've just been handed permission. "That's a good idea," he said, his voice smooth. "Too many accounts create confusion. I could help you manage the process if you'd like." "I'll think about it," I said, matching his calm tone. That night, after they left, I watched the security footage Ava had set up. My father, moments before leaving, had lingered by my desk, his hand brushing against the folder again. He thought he was being subtle. He wasn't. By the end of that month, every safeguard was in place. The fortress around my real assets was impenetrable, while the decoy account gleamed like an unlocked treasure chest. The timing was perfect. My annual bonus had just been deposited, and my birthday was approaching, a milestone they would see as both opportunity and justification. My legal team had copies of every document, every recording, every transaction. Grace had built a forensic trail proving my ownership of all legitimate assets, separate from the decoy. Ava's digital systems were set to record every keystroke if anyone accessed the joint account. The plan wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity. For years, I had allowed my parents to live in the shadow of my success, treating my discipline as a resource to be borrowed rather than a boundary to be respected. Now, I was creating a mirror, one that would reflect their choices back at them. In the quiet moments before it all unfolded, I wrote a note to myself and pinned it above my desk. "You are not destroying your family, you are revealing it." That sentence became my compass, because what I was about to do wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of truth. And truth, I had learned, is the one investment that never loses value. My 35th birthday began with a kind of deceptive peace. The Seattle air carried that familiar chill of early spring, brisk, damp, smelling faintly of salt and cedar. From my apartment window, Lake Union shimmered under a sky the color of pewter. It was the kind of morning that should have felt hopeful, but there was a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't quite shake. I had spent 6 months preparing for this day, building my plan with surgical precision, and now all that remained was to let the trap close. Still, as I stood there sipping my coffee, watching the boats drift by, I couldn't help but wonder if I was ready to watch the truth reveal itself. My parents had insisted on hosting my birthday dinner at their home, just like they used to when I was younger. 35 is a milestone, my mother had said. Let's do it right. Her voice on the phone had been soft, almost maternal, and for a fleeting moment, I wanted to believe that this time it was genuine. Maybe they just wanted to celebrate. Maybe the darkness I had uncovered in them was a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew better. The dinner was never about celebration. It was about opportunity. I drove to their house that afternoon, a modest craftsman overlooking the lake. The sight of it made my stomach tighten. I had spent so many years walking through that front door, hoping to be seen, to be understood, only to leave feeling smaller each time. This time, I would walk in with clarity. The door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there, wearing her pearl earrings and that familiar smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Clara, sweetheart," she said, pulling me into an embrace. "You look beautiful." My father appeared behind her, glass of champagne already in hand, his expression a perfect balance of pride and calculation. "The guest of honor," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "You've accomplished so much, and today we celebrate you." The living room was glowing with golden light. A banner stretched across the mantel, "Happy 35th, Clara," written in looping cursive. On the table sat a cake with white frosting and delicate sugar flowers. Ethan and his fiancée Megan arrived a few minutes later, loud and cheerful, carrying a bouquet of lilies. The room smelled of roast chicken, citrus, and something else, anticipation. As we sat down for dinner, my mother fussed over the dishes, my father kept refilling everyone's glasses, and Ethan talked endlessly about his music cafe project. I listened politely, smiling when necessary, my heartbeat steady but heavy. They were performing a scene, and I was the unwitting character meant to deliver my lines without knowing the script. When dessert arrived, my father raised his glass for a toast. "To Clara," he said, "the daughter who's made us proud beyond measure. You've built a life most people only dream of, and we couldn't be happier to call you ours." The others followed suit, repeating his words, clinking their glasses against mine. The air buzzed with warmth, but underneath it I could feel something cold, metallic, waiting. I smiled and thanked them, keeping my voice calm. "Speaking of dreams," I said lightly, "I just got an alert from one of my investments. It looks like one of my funds hit its target today. I might need to make a few quick adjustments before the markets open again." I pulled my phone from my purse, pretending to scroll through a notification, and stood. "Would you mind if I used the office for a moment?" "Of course, dear," my mother said, her voice smooth. "Take your time." The office looked the same as it always had: mahogany desk, family photos, an old banker's lamp casting soft light over the room. I sat down, unlocked my phone, opened my banking app, and made sure the decoy account was displayed clearly on the screen. Then I placed the phone on the desk, face up, and stepped out of the room under the pretense of using the restroom. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. From the hallway, I checked my smartwatch. The feed from the small camera Ava had helped me install streamed quietly to the screen. For a few seconds, the room was empty. Then the door opened. My father walked in. He closed the door behind him, glancing over his shoulder before approaching the desk. He picked up my phone, his movements quick but controlled. I watched his fingers glide across the screen, navigating with practiced familiarity. He wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what he was doing. A few taps, a pause, a faint tightening of his jaw, and then it happened. A transfer request. $1.5 million from the joint account to an unfamiliar destination. His own account, of course. The screen's glow reflected in his glasses as he confirmed the transaction. I felt a strange calm as I watched him. There it was, the proof, the confirmation of everything I had suspected. When the transaction completed, my smartwatch vibrated gently, an alert from the bank appearing almost instantly. The money was gone. I flushed the toilet, ran the sink, and returned to the office as if nothing had happened. My father was already gone, the room immaculate again. My phone sat where I'd left it, the screen dark. I picked it up, smiled at my reflection in the black glass, and walked back into the living room. The energy had shifted. My father looked lighter, relaxed, as though some invisible burden had lifted. My mother's laughter was louder than before, her gestures more exaggerated. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smug and content, his arm draped lazily around Megan's shoulder. I took my seat quietly, folding my hands in my lap. "To family," my father said suddenly, raising his glass again. "To love and to taking care of each other." "To family," I echoed, meeting his gaze, "and to getting exactly what we deserve." He blinked, hesitating for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. No one else seemed to notice. The rest of the evening blurred into a haze of small talk and forced laughter. I kept my face serene, my tone light, while inside I felt something deeper than anger. Clarity. The kind of stillness that comes when the storm you've been waiting for finally breaks. I didn't feel betrayed anymore. I felt awake. When it was time to leave, I hugged my mother, thanked her for dinner, and promised to call soon. My father walked me to the door, his hand firm on my shoulder. "We're so proud of you, Clara," he said. "You've done everything right." I looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," I said softly. "I learned from the best." The drive home was quiet. The city lights shimmered across the lake like scattered coins, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the ache that usually followed family gatherings. I felt steady, almost serene. The worst had finally happened, and I had survived it. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The notifications were waiting. Transaction confirmed, security footage uploaded, digital logs stored securely. Every piece of evidence was in place. My parents believed they had taken my savings, that their plan had succeeded. But what they had really taken was bait, and in doing so, they had shown me exactly who they were. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel anger. I just sat there, watching the city lights shimmer beyond my window, and thought about how betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or tears. Sometimes it comes in quiet rooms filled with laughter, with people you once trusted, raising their glasses and smiling as they take what was never theirs to claim. The morning after my 35th birthday dawned with an unsettling calm, the kind that follows a storm still brewing beneath the horizon. I woke before the sun rose, the apartment shrouded in the soft gray of a Seattle morning. My phone was silent on the nightstand, but my mind wasn't. The images from the night before replayed with cinematic precision. My father's deliberate hands on my phone, the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes, the toast to family. It wasn't a nightmare. It was proof, the kind of proof that burns away any remaining illusions. I moved through the motions of my morning routine: coffee, shower, dark gray suit pressed to perfection. Everything about my actions felt ceremonial, deliberate, like armor being fastened for battle. This wasn't about rage anymore. It wasn't even about justice. It was about truth. And truth, I had learned, demands clarity, not chaos. By 9:30, I was parked in front of my parents' house, the same Craftsman overlooking Lake Union where I'd celebrated the night before. Their cars were already in the driveway, along with Ethan's beaten-down truck. Through the living room window, I could see silhouettes moving, flashes of laughter. They were celebrating. Their victory, my supposed downfall. The scene should have broken me. Instead, it strengthened my resolve. I didn't knock. I still had a key. As the door swung open, the familiar scent of coffee and toasted bread wrapped around me, cruelly domestic. I followed the sound of their voices to the dining room. There they were, my father, my mother, and Ethan, seated around the table like a tableau of triumph. A bottle of champagne stood half empty beside a plate of pastries. My father was holding a printed spreadsheet, my mother leaning in to look, and Ethan grinning like a boy who'd just gotten away with something. When they noticed me, the room fell into stunned silence. My father's face froze, his smile curdling mid-expression. My mother's hand shot out to cover the papers in front of her. Ethan muttered something under his breath and looked toward the door, as if calculating an escape route. "Clara," my mother began, voice trembling slightly, "we didn't expect you this morning." "Clearly," I replied, stepping further into the room. My voice was steady, almost too calm. "Don't stop the celebration on my account. It looks like you're having a lovely morning." My father stood, trying to reclaim authority with a forced smile. "We were just having brunch. Sit down, sweetheart. Let's talk like a family." I placed my briefcase on the table and opened it slowly, the sound of the latch snapping echoing through the quiet. "That's exactly what I came here to do." My mother shifted in her chair, her eyes darting nervously between me and the briefcase. "Clara, what's going on? You're scaring me." I took out a stack of papers, bank statements, screenshots, timestamps, and laid them on the table one by one. Last night, while we were celebrating, a transfer of $1.5 million was made from the joint account into your account, Dad. That's your signature on the transaction confirmation, isn't it? He didn't answer. His expression tightened, the mask slipping just enough for guilt to show through. My mother reached for the papers, but I stopped her with a look that made her hand fall still. "Before you say anything," I continued, "I want you to hear something." I pulled out a small voice recorder, pressed play, and set it on the table. The room filled with their voices, the recording from weeks earlier when I had overheard them through the kitchen window. My father's tone was unmistakable. "She must have close to 1 million by now," he said. "She trusts us. Once it's done, what can she really do?" My mother's reply came next, soft but sharp. "Ethan needs help. It's only fair." When the recording ended, no one moved. My father's face had gone pale, his jaw locked. My mother's lips trembled as she whispered, "You were spying on us?" "I was protecting myself," I said quietly. "Something you taught me to do, never trust anyone without proof." Ethan broke the silence, his voice defensive. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is. It's a joint account, Clara. Technically, we didn't steal anything." I looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You didn't just steal money. You stole trust, the last piece of it I had left to give. And I think you knew exactly what you were doing." My father straightened, his tone turning cold. "We haven't done anything illegal. You can't prove intent." I slid another document across the table. "That's where you're wrong. These are copies of the security footage from last night. You used my phone to initiate the transfer. The timestamp matches the transaction to the second. I also have records of your previous login attempts and photos you took of my financial documents." I looked him in the eye. "I can prove everything." He sank back into his chair, his confidence unraveling. My mother covered her mouth, tears starting to form. "We just wanted to help Ethan," she said. "You have so much, Clara. You've always been fine. He needed a chance." I felt a pang deep in my chest, something like sadness but heavier. "You didn't ask for help," I said softly. "You took. You assumed you were entitled to what I worked for. You told yourselves it was love, but love doesn't take without consent. Love asks. Love respects." No one spoke. Even Ethan looked away. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch before continuing. "You have 72 hours to return the full amount plus 3% interest. If you don't, my attorney will file charges for financial exploitation and theft, along with a civil claim for damages. The evidence I've collected is more than enough." My father's eyes flashed with something between disbelief and fear. "You would do that to your own family?" "You already did," I said. "I'm just responding." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. My mother reached across the table toward me, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said quietly. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." I gathered my papers, closed the briefcase, and turned toward the door. Then I paused, looking back at them one last time. "You know," I said, "if you had just asked me for help with Ethan's project, I probably would have given it. Not all of it, but enough. Instead, you decided to take everything, and in doing so, you lost the only thing you couldn't buy back." My father looked away, his face ashen. My mother started to cry softly, the sound barely audible. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the table as though the wood grain might offer an escape. As I stepped out onto the porch, the air hit me like a baptism, cold, sharp, cleansing. The weight I had carried for years began to lift. It wasn't victory I felt, it was freedom. The truth had cost me my family, but it had given me something greater, myself. Over the next 3 days, I heard nothing from them. No calls, no emails, no attempts at defense. Then, on the 71st hour, a notification appeared on my phone. A deposit of $1,545,000, every cent returned, plus interest calculated to the penny. My father's precision remained intact, even in defeat. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing it and taking a deep breath. There was no triumph in that moment, only peace. Grace had won where anger would have destroyed me. And sometimes, that's the only victory worth having, the quiet kind that leaves no ashes behind. The weeks after the confrontation felt like walking through silence after an explosion. Everything was still standing, but nothing felt familiar. My phone barely rang. My parents didn't call. Ethan didn't text. The space they left behind should have felt empty, but instead it felt clean, like the air after rain. For the first time in my adult life, I could hear my own thoughts without them being drowned out by obligation or guilt. I had always assumed that losing your family meant devastation. What I hadn't realized was that sometimes loss is what freedom sounds like. I spent the first few days in quiet reflection, not out of regret, but necessity. My apartment, once just a resting place between long workdays, began to feel like home. I moved through the rooms slowly, clearing away the physical and emotional clutter of years spent proving my worth to people who never really wanted to see it. I deleted their spare keys from my keychain, changed my emergency contacts, and updated every document that tied them to my name. Each small action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I didn't know I'd given away. When the transfer confirmation came through, $1,545,000 returned, the 3% interest calculated exactly to the cent, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a quiet sadness that carried its own kind of peace. My father's precision had remained even in surrender. It was his final act of control, and in a strange way, it felt like closure. They had done what they always did, handled things efficiently, without apology, without emotion. But this time, their silence wasn't power. It was distance. After the money was returned, I sent one final email through my attorney. It was brief, professional, and final. It stated that all financial and legal matters were now closed, that I wished no further contact, and that any future attempts to access my information would be treated as harassment. My lawyer called it boundary enforcement. I called it survival. The first few weeks without them felt disorienting. Family, even toxic family, provides structure. Calls on holidays, traditions that repeat like clockwork, the illusion of connection. When that pattern breaks, you're left with silence that feels both terrifying and exhilarating. I filled that silence with long walks around the lake, books I'd never had time to finish, and long conversations with myself about what family should mean. Healing wasn't linear. Some nights, I woke up from dreams where everything was back to normal. Dinners, laughter, my mother humming in the kitchen. But even in those dreams, there was always something off, something heavy in the air. I'd wake up with tears on my face and the reminder that some love is not meant to be repaired. It's meant to be released. To make sense of the chaos, I started therapy again. My therapist, a gentle woman named Dr. Marlene Shaw, specialized in family trauma. She had a calm way of making truth sound less like blame and more like liberation. "You've been the caretaker since childhood," she said during our first session. The responsible one, the rescuer. That role becomes a prison when it's never reciprocated. Her words hit hard, not because they were new, but because they were undeniable. We spent months unraveling the threads of my identity, how self-sufficiency had become both my armor and my cage, how I'd mistaken control for safety. Through that process, I began to see that forgiveness didn't have to mean reconciliation. Forgiveness could simply mean releasing the hope that the past might have been different. During this time, I made changes. I moved from my small apartment into a high-rise overlooking the San Francisco Bay, a city I'd always loved from a distance. The move was more than a change of scenery. It was a statement. I wanted to build a life that reflected who I'd become, not the person I'd been trying to be for them. My new space was filled with light and quiet strength. Minimalist decor, books, framed photos of people who had truly stood by me. Professionally, I channeled my experience into something purposeful. At work, I began specializing in financial ethics and protection for high-earning women. I started hosting private seminars teaching women how to safeguard their assets, not just from scams or fraud, but from emotional manipulation disguised as love. I spoke openly about my story, not as a tale of revenge, but as one of awareness. The response was overwhelming. Women of all ages came forward, sharing stories of siblings, parents, or spouses who had drained their finances under the banner of family loyalty. What had happened to me wasn't rare. It was just rarely spoken about. The idea for a foundation came one evening while I was mentoring a young analyst who'd been struggling with her family's financial expectations. "They treat my paycheck like it belongs to all of us," she said, tears in her eyes. That sentence echoed something deep inside me. Within months, I began the groundwork for what would become the Silver Compass Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping women navigate financial abuse, set boundaries, and rebuild autonomy. The name came from something Grace Liu had once told me during those long planning nights before the betrayal unfolded. A compass doesn't tell you where to go. It helps you find your way back when you're lost. Through the foundation, I met dozens of women who carried stories that mirrored my own. Doctors whose siblings drained their savings, single mothers whose parents stole inheritances for the family, entrepreneurs manipulated by partners who equated love with access. Each story was heartbreaking, but together, they formed something powerful: community. Healing, I realized, is never solitary. It grows in the spaces where pain is shared without shame. In that new community, I found people who didn't see me as a provider or a savior, but as a person. And in their company, I began to rediscover something I hadn't felt in years: trust. One of those people was Michael Turner, a professor of corporate ethics I met at a financial integrity conference. He had the kind of calm presence that made honesty feel effortless. Our conversation started professionally, then stretched into long evenings of laughter, books, and quiet understanding. When I told him my story, he didn't pity me. He listened. "You didn't just protect your money," he said once over dinner. "You protected your peace. Most people spend a lifetime trying to learn how to do that." By the time my 36th birthday arrived, I didn't want a grand celebration. Instead, I hosted a dinner in my new home, a small gathering of friends, colleagues, and women from the foundation. The room was filled with warmth and genuine joy, the kind that doesn't need perfection to feel complete. As we raised our glasses, I looked around at the faces of people who had become my chosen family. There was laughter, gratitude, and not a single trace of the performative love I had grown up with. That night, as candles burned low and the city lights shimmered beyond the glass, I stood by the window and thought about how far I'd come. My life wasn't untouched by pain, but it was finally mine, uncorrupted, unshared, unburdened. I had learned that money reveals character, but boundaries reveal self-worth. I had learned that forgiveness is not a door you open for those who hurt you. It's a window you open for yourself to breathe again. If there's one truth that carried me through it all, it's this: family is not defined by blood, but by behavior. Love that requires you to shrink isn't love, it's leverage. And peace, once earned, is the most valuable investment of all. When I blew out the candle on my simple chocolate cake that night, I made only one wish, not for success or safety or even love, but for courage. Courage to keep my boundaries strong, my heart open, and my life aligned with truth. For the first time in decades, that wish felt less like a hope and more like a promise I had already begun to keep. Looking back on my story, it feels less like a tale of betrayal and more like a lesson in awakening. My name is Clara Jennings, and for years I believed that love and loyalty meant sacrifice, that being the responsible one in the family required endless forgiveness. But the moment my parents chose to take what wasn't theirs, I saw the truth with unflinching clarity. I had spent my life earning the approval of people who were only comfortable with my strength as long as it benefited them. What they stole wasn't just money, it was trust. And with their actions, they destroyed the illusion I had been living under since childhood. Yet from that loss, I built something new. I reclaimed my peace, my purpose, and my understanding of what love should actually look like. The greatest lesson I learned is that boundaries are not barriers. They are bridges to self-respect. Protecting yourself doesn't make you cold or selfish, it makes you wise. In a world where emotional manipulation often hides behind the mask of family, choosing yourself is not betrayal, it's survival. And when you finally learn to stand on your own terms, you stop attracting people who take and start surrounding yourself with those who give back. So, I leave you with a question. If you discovered that someone close to you had betrayed your trust, would you A, forgive them and try to rebuild the relationship? B, walk away and focus on healing, no matter how much it hurts? Drop your answer, or B, in the comments below. I'd love to know how you would face that kind of choice. And tell me, what do you think defines real loyalty, blood, or behavior? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective. If this story touched you or made you reflect on your own boundaries, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful stories that remind us all: protecting your peace is the most powerful act of love you can ever give yourself.